Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Perth Dialogues. And I'm very thankful for Vern Hughes to giving us time again, his very precious time, and especially during this period when it's between Christmas and New Year. Thank you, Vern, and welcome back.
Thank you. Good to have a conversation again.
Yeah, it's you have been giving such insightful thoughts in our earlier podcast as well in the general political climate, and then now even on LinkedIn, I've been following you. I've been reading what you say, and because of that, I've been very interested in knowing your perspectives on the Bondi terror attack. It's been defined as a seminal point or a turning point in Australian history. All sorts of words have been used to define it, and again the words have been defined to describe its response from both political sides, from security sides, from community side. So I just wanted to let's get together and talk about that. What do you think? Was you have your very strong opinions, so let's start from start. What do you think about this whole Bondi terror attack and the response till now overall, and then we'll go into specifics.
Overall, it's the response, I think, has been a disappointingly alarmist response in Australia. It tended to be hysterical in some respects, but you've got to always remember that the media will tend to react to something like this in a fairly hysterical way, and politicians will tend to react to it often in a not very considered way. So, and for me, it's by no means the most important incident like this that has concerned Australians. I would say the Bali bombing, which occurred in Indonesia, but in a place that many Australians have been to, so it felt quite at home, and many Australians were killed. But it was a genuine terrorist attack. It was planned by a group of people. It was intended to kill many Australians. It succeeded. I think that was clearly a more serious terrorist attack that affected Australians than Bondi. But what tends to happen, of course, is that people don't think very clearly when these things happen. They tend not to remember other things that have happened very, very accurately. So a lot of people will then rush in and say, "Oh, this is the worst. This is the worst terrorist attack we've ever experienced, and this is a defining moment for the country." And I would say, no, not really. I don't think it's a defining moment. I think it's a very sad moment in terms of a number of ongoing issues, and those issues have been ongoing for many years, and they'll continue to be ongoing. And they are issues around how Australia sits in relation to Israel and Palestine, what position Australians take, what position an Australian government takes on those issues. Then alongside of that, there's an ongoing discussion about Muslims in Australian society, to what extent they are fitting in, to what extent they're integrating or not integrating, and that's an ongoing discussion. And then alongside that, again, there's a bigger discussion about immigration. How many people should come into the country and how should they be selected? And an incident like this will tend to blur all those things together. So people will comment about all of them, often in ways that are fairly ill-considered and often fairly confused and sometimes contradictory. In some ways, you can argue that this is not really about immigration at all. And yet I've heard many coalition politicians say this is this is all about immigration, and this shows the failure of our immigration policy. And so when you unpack that idea, you realise there's a lot of things going on there that are fairly confused. So that's what I've tended to think over the last couple of weeks.
Thanks. It is a multi-causal situation. There's no one point that you can take up and explain everything about this attack. But you've also said that this attack was inevitable, that it was going to be happening sometime, somewhere. Why do you think that?
I tend to think that, one of the things that happens is that, Australians are really shocked when incidents like this occur, because they're very disruptive. They disrupt the picture that we have of life in Australia, which is fairly calm, peaceful. And in other parts of the world, there are incidents like this that are happening every day. And it's, so Australians have become used to being used to living in a place where these things don't happen. And one of the reactions of Australians when this does happen is to say, well, this is caused by outside elements, people who don't really belong in Australia. And so for some reason, they've been allowed in here. They've brought this violence. It doesn't belong here. And something's gone wrong that they've been allowed to be here. That's one kind of response. And, that's a frustrating response to hear, because incidents like this happen around the world every day. Often, in many parts of the world, terrorist events are quite normal. And so there's a kind of very naive Australian response which says, well, we just, if this has happened, then someone must be to blame, and we have to find out who is to blame, and they have to be held accountable. Now, in this particular case, I don't think anyone is to blame, really. It's just a sad event. You can never stop some individuals who have issues going on. You can never stop some individuals from doing crazy things. It doesn't happen very often, but it will happen every now and then. But I don't think in this case that there's any point in asking the question, who is to blame? I think it's a silly question. I don't think the Australian government is particularly to blame. There are factors at work, sure, and we can talk about what the factors at work might be, but they're not things that the Australian government is directly in control of. So to me, it doesn't make much sense to think that the Australian government should be held responsible for this. But I have heard that from many Liberal and National Party politicians.
Right. So when we are looking at the reasons for this attack, how much do you think Israel-Hamas conflict is somewhere in the root of this clause?
I think it is. It's part of the background that has been, for all of us around the world over the last 2 years. And it's been a shocking thing that has been happening. And people will respond to it, in many ways. And, the response internationally has been very strong. So in some parts of the world, yes, in places in the world where there's a strong Arab or Muslim population, there's been a very strong reaction to all of that, and a strong sense of frustration that nothing has been effectively done to stop the killing. that causes some people to be extremely frustrated, and there will be some individuals who decide to lash out in response. So in the United States, for instance, I'm aware of some shootings, some bombings that are directed at Jewish people. Not too many, but there have been some. They're tragic, they're pointless, but they happen. In the United States, the response to the last 2 years has been fascinating because for the first time ever, of opinion a big section of opinion in American society has shifted away from traditional support for Israel. So the polls have shown for the first time ever that 53% of Americans are now more sympathetic to Palestine than they are to Israel, which is a stunning change, which means that a lot of young people don't think about those issues in the way that their parents did. A lot of young Jews don't think about it in the way that their parents did. A lot of people who are conservatives don't think of it in the way that other conservatives have thought about it. So that's very interesting. In Australia, I've been very disappointed with the public debate about these issues here. And that's partly because, we have a poor public debate on most things, and this one's no exception. Our media is dominated by a handful of big organisations, and it tends to be that the influence of the pro-Israel lobby is very strong in those organisations. So if you look at the News Corp media organisations, they've been astonishingly pro-Israel in a way that is quite shocking, really, because they make no attempt to offer a balanced view of the issues or even to present various opinions. They just don't have various opinions at all. There is only one opinion. And on the Palestinian side, there have been a lot of protests from activists about this, and I always regard protests as a bit problematic because I'm not the sort of person who likes to participate in protests. I did it a bit in my youth, but I don't like protest actions. I don't like the chanting of slogans. It tends to be a bit mindless for me. I would prefer people just had an in-depth conversation about these issues, one-to-one or in a group situation, and actually unpacked all of the things that are going on and trying to reach some sensible conclusions about how things can improve. So there have been a lot of protests, and people on the right tend to look at those protests that are pro-Palestinian and think, we should stop this. We should close down the protests. We should stop people voicing opinions that are critical of Israel. And I find that response fairly strange because often it comes from the very same people who say they support freedom of speech. And one of the things about the freedom of speech issue is that very few people are consistent in supporting freedom of speech. Many people who say they support freedom of speech now say they want to introduce hate speech laws to stop people being critical of Israel. Now, to me, that is crazy. I tend to be a bit of a purist on the issue of free speech. I don't think it's possible to regulate hate speech very, very effectively. So it's best just to allow people to say what they like, subject to a limit which kicks in if anyone advocates violence or indeed commits violent activities. Well, then that should be a matter for the law. But up until that point, people should pretty much be able to say what they think, because it's just too difficult to try to regulate it in any other way. That's my view on that issue. So I have been a bit appalled in the last couple of weeks to hear quite a number of people say protest marches that are supporting Palestine should be disallowed. They should be disallowed. And I think, whoa, no, this is not consistent with support for freedom of speech.
So I still haven't made my mind. I still can't understand why every time something happens, the normal response is that we'll bring more laws to control speech in the name of hate speech laws, and we'll bring more laws to control the weapons or anything that the people have, be it gun laws, be it knife laws, everything what people have, which were not even involved in any way with that incident. Instead of actually tackling why something happened or what's the response, the causal responses of anything which has happened. But how do you see, you talked about the response of the Liberal and National parties to the incidents. How do you assess the response or the leadership that has the Prime Minister shown and the Labour Party as a federal government has shown in response to this? How do you rank them, or how would you rate them?
I think the response of the Australian government has been poor. They're super cautious about everything at the moment. So they're very cautious about not offending the pro-Israel lobby. So over the last 2 years, in relation to the events in Gaza, they've tried to walk a fine line. They've tried to say, yes, we're concerned about Israel's actions, the number of deaths, the number of innocents who've been killed. We're concerned about the practices of the Israeli Defense Force, which tend to adopt a working policy, which is that if you can kill one combatant, but that involves taking the life of 10, 20, 30, 50 innocents, non-combatants, then that's okay. Up to about 50 seems to be okay, 50-1 ratio. Whereas in most militaries in the world, if an action involves taking the life of a non-combatant, then anything more than a 2-1 ratio is frowned upon as being unethical. That is, if you have to kill a combatant and you have to take out 2 civilians in the process, then that's something you've got to think about carefully. But more than 2, 5 or 10, no, it's not acceptable. And the US military has quite clear rules about this. It just doesn't allow the taking of non-combatant lives in that way. And the same for the Australian and British military forces. It's just it's the traditional rules of war. Israel doesn't abide by those rules. And so in Gaza, their view is all civilians are involved in somehow in support for Hamas. And that allows them to kill not only big numbers of civilian people, but to destroy civilian infrastructure on large scale. So all universities, all schools have been destroyed. Quite astonishing destruction that has been taken place. And so even on something like that, as relatively clear-cut as all that is, the Albanese government has been very reluctant to talk about it directly. It will mouth platitudes and say, we have concerns about what's going on in Gaza, but they always stop short of any direct criticism of Israel. And they do that because they're always worried about the pro-Israel lobby coming back and making life difficult for them. Now, my view would be that overly cautious approach hasn't really worked for them, and it never works because the pro-Israel lobby will always make life difficult for anyone who is not 100% pro-Israel. And so now the pro-Israel lobby has it in for the Albanese government and says, in the wake of the Bondi event, the Albanese government is responsible. Their inaction in reining in anti-Semitism has led to the Bondi shootings. Now, I think that's just fairly shameless politicking because there's very little an Australian government can do to rein in anti-Semitism. It's been overly cautious. It has not said anything that is a license for anti-Semites to cause trouble. So I think the pro-Israel lobby really is being quite duplicitous on this. I think they see an opportunity in the wake of the Bondi event to put pressure on the Albanese government, and that's working, I think. They want the Albanese government to apologise for its inaction. I think that's silly, but it seems to have worked. I think a couple of Labor ministers have apologised and said we could have done more to rein in anti-Semitism. I don't think that's true, actually. I don't think there's very much more they could do to rein in anti-Semitism. If there is anti-Semitism in the Australian community, it's largely anti-Israel sentiment, which has, been significant. There is a lot of anti-Israel sentiment because of Israel's actions in Gaza. But I don't think there's any wave of anti-Semitism in Australia. Anti-Semitism in the sense of the anti-Semitism that we actually had in Australia 100 years ago. If you go back 100 years, many organisations that were membership-based organisations in Australia had a policy of not allowing Jews to be members. Sporting clubs often had a sign saying, no Jews allowed. And I know this because my partner and her family were members of a tennis club in Melbourne called the Royal South Yarra Tennis Club. It's quite an establishment tennis club. It's, it's a sort of high status tennis club. And I often jibe her by reminding her, and I've seen the signs and the posters which say this. The Royal South Yarra Tennis Club had a policy of no Jews allowed in the 1920s and 30s. You just weren't allowed to be a member. And they proudly displayed this in the club. So that is real anti-Semitism. That's what anti-Semitism means. It means actively excluding Jews from being part of normal life. That's real anti-Semitism. Being critical of Israel is something quite different. You can be critical of Israel for all sorts of reasons and not be an be guilty of anti-Semitism. But in the political context following the criticism of Israel that we've seen over the last 2 years, one of the things that's happened is that many in the pro-Israel lobby now say to be critical of Israel is to be anti-Semitic. And that's just nonsense, in my view.
I've been reading about the response and why the government has failed from in the news, and there's always been this narrative that the government has allowed all these protests from people supporting Palestine, and they have been sloganeering something like "gas the Jews," "do this, do that." There's been a lot of protests around across Australia, which has increased the anger of Palestinians and Australians in large towards Israel, which then is taken out against the Jews. The second thing which the government has done is that it has actually gone and recognized the state of Palestine with other recently. And third was that it has got the report from the Commissioner on Anti-Semitism, but it had delayed that accepting or releasing that report. It's just released now. So on actions, the government has been supporting the pro-Palestine voices much more than the pro-Israel or Jewish voices. How do we square those two things?
Well, I would say that the government has been very reluctant to criticise Israel. It has done a couple of things, but only things that it has judged to be safe, relatively safe politically, by joining other Western countries. So on the issue of recognition of a Palestinian state, Labor has faced pressure for 20 years to do that. And it always resisted that pressure because it didn't want to antagonise the pro-Israel lobby. But when it saw that Britain and France and Canada and New Zealand were going to take that step, it joined in, and it did it that way, and that was a relatively safe way for them to do it. It still didn't appease the pro-Israel lobby. They were still angry about it, but it was a fairly risk-free step for the Australian government to take when it joined with all those other Western countries, because you can deflect the criticism and say, well, most countries in the world now recognise Palestine. Now, the pro-Israel lobby will still say, oh, that recognition has encouraged anti-Israel sentiment, and it has encouraged anti-Semitic sentiment. Well, I can't see how you can argue that, really. The idea of a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state is recognised by most countries in the world as something that's necessary to put an end to the ongoing violence and conflict. It's just a necessary step to, as part of a larger settlement, to actually put an end to the violence that has gone on there. But still, the pro-Israel lobby wants to say, oh, this has encouraged anti-Semitism. I just can't see how that makes sense. It hasn't encouraged anti-Semitism at all. If we can try and look into the mind of the father and son who were responsible for the Bondi shooting, in as much as we can do that, it seems likely that they have been influenced by Israel's actions in Gaza. They see the world not doing much to stop that killing, and in a moment of desperation, they decide to take matters into their own hands and kill some Jews in retaliation. Now, in as much as if that was what's going on in their mind, we can sort of, we can understand that to some extent without condoning it. It's madness, but nevertheless, it's probably something like that has gone on in their minds. And I guess we could say, well, in that warped view of the world, they think we need to do something to even up the ledger a bit. We'll kill 15 Jews. And so they've gone out and done it. Completely senseless act, but they've gone and done it. But I just don't think you can say, well, have they been encouraged in that because Australia has recognised Palestine? I don't think so. I don't think they've been encouraged in that by anything except their own feelings of wanting to do something about the situation in Palestine, not knowing what to do that is constructive. And so in desperation, they've opted for a senseless, violent response, which will achieve nothing, will have caused the loss of one of their own lives and long life imprisonment for the other. So a completely senseless activity. And I just think, it's very difficult to try to argue that those people have been encouraged by the Australian government's actions. I can't see that their actions will have been influenced by anything that the Australian government has done. Their actions are driven by their own powerlessness and their own warped sense of how they might be able to make an impact on the world. That's my best guess at what's happened.
Let's come to the law enforcement angle. There were reports that these two father-son duo have been on ACO's watch list since 2019. They were on the radar, they fell on the radar, they were going to foreign countries for training. They have been increasingly being radicalized over the last 2 years. Where did we fell wrong, both from the security and assessment point of view, and then with the immediate response to the incident where there were reports that the police was first not providing sufficient security when they were being asked that there is a risk and we need security, and then the police was supposedly, allegedly late to come to the incidents, the site when the incident shooting was happening, and subsequent to that. So I'm just asking both in terms of security assessment and the police response to the incident.
Yeah, and I think this is, the discussion about those issues has taken us back to the period after 9/11, in that decade where there was the war against terror, and we had, it was a period in which there was a lot of talk about a war against terror, which the Australian government and other Western governments ramped up a whole range of security arrangements, additional surveillance, additional monitoring, trying to monitor processes of radicalization amongst sections of the Islamic community, all of which was very, I think you can say, half-baked, very ineffective, and it's difficult to assess the effectiveness of all of that because there is a large degree of secrecy that surrounds it. So in that period, in the early 2000s, and again in the last 2 years, I hear that ASIO and the police forces have monitored radicalization of Islamic groups. They occasionally intervene. They detain people. Sometimes they intervene, monitor people, then make a judgment that they're not a security threat. They do that apparently all the time. It's very hard for any of us to assess what they do or how effective it is because it's just not open. The information isn't there. But I suspect that all of that is fairly ineffective because even if there are individuals in the Muslim community who are radicalized, as indeed it happens, quite a bit. it's a very difficult process for an outside organisation to monitor. It's very difficult to influence, and it's very difficult to stop if there are people who are intent on acting upon their radicalised views, if they intend to commit some violent act. It's very difficult for the authorities to be sufficiently on top of all that to be able to intervene when it matters. So I think generally the idea that many in the public have that, well, the authorities should be able to stop these things. Well, I would say it's very, very difficult, actually, to stop these things. And there are always, which is apparently, I think, why there are incidents that slip through that aren't detected, which apparently are a surprise to the authorities. And I think that's inevitable to a large extent. I don't think we would need a massive surveillance state and a massive security infrastructure to think that we can stop every single incident like this. And I think it's unwise. I think it's unwise for us to put in place, a massive surveillance state to stop very rare incidents like this when they happen. So that would be my response. But that isn't satisfactory for many people who, in the heat of the initial response to shootings, will tend to think, why was this allowed? Why wasn't something done to identify these two people earlier and detain them? That's the emotional response, but I think my response would be it's actually very difficult to do that. And it's probably not worth adopting such a massive surveillance state that's capable of doing it. That's probably not a good thing to put in place a big surveillance state in the first place, even if that's a fairly unpopular view, I think.
Fair enough. The other thing which I wanted to ask you is that I came in Australia in 2014, and since 2014, the year I came, we had Lint siege, cafe siege, and there have been since then 11 cases of terror attack, one or two people dying, where the police have actually termed it as a terror attack. 9 of them were ISIS inspired attacks. On the contrary, since last 4-5 years, every time we have the ACO director or the government minister coming, they always say the highest risk to Australian community is from far right extremists. So we have this list of attacks coming from ISIS inspired people, radicalized, and the government saying the risk is from the far right. How do we people understand these two?
My response to this is that in both cases the level of threat posed is very small from both the far right groups and from Islamist inspired people. I think it's very slight. Of course, it tends to get, in the aftermath of an incident like Bondi, it will tend to be, it'll take a big focus in the media, and therefore it'll tend to become overblown and exaggerated, and the threat made to be much greater than it is. I think Australia, we're still remarkably fortunate in that we have always been relatively immune from political violence. And I think it's still true that we are relatively immune from political violence. And in as much as there are now some far-right groups who are trying to get themselves organised, I think their threat is minimal. I don't think it's, they're no significant threat to anything as far as I can see. Um, the Islamist people, I don't. Again, I think they're a. I don't think they're a serious threat to anything much in Australia. Um, the problem is largely one of um, the isolation of such individuals, such that they're not able to be moderated or controlled by their own community and or reined in, so that if there are Islamist sentiments that appear in a particular place, um, what you want to happen ideally is that other people in those communities are able to moderate that, caution hot-headed people from anything involving violence, and just persuade them to give it up, basically, as not worth doing. That's what you want to happen. You want that to happen before it ever gets to the attention of the security forces. And that happens most of the time. We never hear about that, but because it's never newsworthy. I know this from some of my own connections in Muslim communities, and this happens all the time. There are troubled young people, have to be counselled, they have to be advised. Sometimes people recommend that they go and they move interstate, stay with a family friend who's will keep an eye on them, remove them from any bad influences, and then give them a few months, and then they can come back home, and hopefully they will have got it out of their system. So this is the way these things are normally dealt with. It's just that there are some occasions where, if people are in touch with a sufficient organised form of Islamism, that they might take it a bit further. They might train in certain kinds of actions. They might prepare for some violent action. They might actually go through with it. But it's still very, very rare. And the most important part of that whole process is the prevention that happens early on. That's still by far the most important part of the whole process. And again, I think the whole threat from the so-called far right groups is vastly overstated. And I know I've had this discussion with some people in relation to the rise of One Nation, which is now polling well and growing. And some people say, well, look at the rise of One Nation. Isn't there a threat from the far right there? And I say, no, I don't think so. One Nation is a protest party. It's capturing some electoral interest at the moment, but it's no threat to anything, really. It's not a far right movement. It's just not a serious organisation in that sense, in the sense that there are serious far-right movements in some European countries. We don't have them, and One Nation is not like that. It is an amateurish protest outfit that is not going to be a serious threat to any of our institutions. But some people will just say, casually, this is a far-right threat. And I don't think it is, actually.
Being on the law enforcement itself, uh, how do you see the government's response, both at the federal level and the New South Wales government? And it was discussed in the national cabinet itself. So not all of the Labour governments, state governments, have actually agreed to bring in more stronger gun laws, reduce the threshold where you can actually get people onto the hate speech laws. How do you assess this political response and legal response to this attack?
It's again, it's from the government side. I think it's a knee-jerk response. Again, their motivation is they want to be seen to be doing something, so they will look at gun laws. Now, by and large, gun violence is not a big problem in Australia. It's relatively small compared to other countries, and we have relatively good gun laws. That said, there are apparently many more guns around now than there were 30 years ago, 20 years ago, at the time of John Howard's gun control measures. And if you look at the father and son who are responsible for the Bondi shooting and how they managed to get 6 rifles and to use them in killing 15 people, you can ask questions. All right, how did they get those 6 rifles? How might that process have been a better process, such that they might have accessed a maximum of 2, but not 6? I don't know. I don't know what the details of that are, but generally, I think it's a bit of a knee-jerk response, driven by the desire to be seen to be doing something, because the issue is not really guns. It's, in the case of those 2 individuals, it's two very desperate, slightly unhinged, powerless individuals who decided to do something tragic. So the gun issue is one element of it, but it shouldn't really be the main focus, because I don't think it is. I don't think it warrants that. That's just kind of it's a kind of misdirection, I think, in the attention of governments. I think better for governments to be looking at trying to identify, where there are pockets of people who may have an inclination who are so alienated from society that they may have an inclination to take actions like this. It's difficult to do, but it's probably a more fruitful area for governments to think about than simply beefing up the gun laws.
Um, as an outsider, when I came in, and this is what I've this is my observation, is that when John Howard did this gun buyback thing, or he brought his gun laws, he was so popular that it has become a template for our politicians to use every time there is an attack. So if it's a knife attack, there'll be a knife law. There's a gun attack, there's more
Yeah,
gun laws. And it has become a template for
yeah.
every level of government, be it a state government, federal government, even local governments have been trying to bring out something. Are we minimizing the actual nature or the role or the responsibility of the state to showing something that we have done, instead of actually going back and analyzing how has that person reached that stage that he has? Because in this case, both the people had guns for 10 years. They never thought of using that gun in the last 2 3 years. So something had changed. So
Yeah.
instead of attacking or realizing that thing, they've gone to gun laws. It's a default template to use. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's true. I think for some reason, uh, the use of knives by disaffected young people is greater than it was 10 years ago. Is this because there are more of those knives available now? No, probably not. Is it that the constraints that perhaps once prevented people from ever getting access to a knife or even contemplating using it? Perhaps have they broken down? Have they broken down such that there are now more people who possess knives and are prepared to use them? I think that seems to be true. It's hard to know what the cause of that is, but I agree with you that it's a very knee-jerk response from state governments to simply say, um, in response to a knife attack where there's one person killed and another one injured, state government will the very next day will declare that a certain kind of knife will now be banned or it'll be severely limited in excuse. It's a very predictable response. It's just typical short-term crisis management, a political response which doesn't get to the root cause of anything. So it's an ongoing problem. I don't really know what the causes are for the increase of the use of knives and machetes in things like violent home entries and burglaries, but there does seem to be an increase in that. Yeah, I think it's, and again, I think it's at the state level where, where management of crime is primarily a state government responsibility, and in Victoria, yeah, we've got, for various reasons, an increase in crime over the last 12 months, and the state government really doesn't know what to do that. So and because the Liberal Party here has talked a lot about cracking down on crime, increasing penalties for youth offenders in a very simplistic way, the Labor government has replicated the same positions. It's increased the penalties for youth offenders. It's dramatically increased some of those penalties. It's allowed police to be able to intercept a member of the public in the street, ask for identification on suspicion that they may have a knife. And this is a major change in the way police operate. The police traditionally have not been allowed to just intercept someone on the suspicion that they may be going to commit a crime. That's not been enough to warrant that kind of police power. But now the police in Victoria have that power. So there is a significant change going on towards greater police powers, greater surveillance of citizens, in the hope that that will somehow reduce crime. But I would say it's more just a hope that it will reduce crime rather than a clear strategy to reduce crime. If you want to actually reduce crime, you would do some, I think, better things that are better targeted at the reasons criminal activity takes place.
Um, you said it so perfectly because there was a recently report on WA knife laws and the impact it has. So, what in WA knife laws, the police can decide this area is now a protected area or something like that. I just don't know the exact wording. And now the police has got powers to search anyone who comes in this area. No, there's no suspicion or there's no reasons given. And if you are found with a certain kind of knives or similar weapons, something like that, they can be taken away. And I think the report said that there were 226 people, something, or similar number of weapons which were taken away from people. There's no mention that these people were intending to do any harm to anyone, or were these actually weapons? nothing. So they were just on suspicion something was taken away from people. And I was thinking, what's next? Can we then start taking away baseball bats? Can we start taking away any metal objects which is in my car? Because I can have a jack which I can beat some two people away. So what's next? That's a slippery slope now.
Yeah, I think it's a worrying trend, and it's not hard to work out why. I mean, um, generally, I think Western societies like Australia are being hollowed out. Um, that is, there used to be a lot of things that happened, not just at the level of the state, but at the level in civil society, and civil society, that is, where communities and citizens were responsible for a whole range of things in, community groups and in sporting activity and in arts and entertainment and in a whole range of areas. I took responsibility for it, involved big sections of the population in doing things. All of that has thinned out quite dramatically. And one of the consequences of that is that people who are fragile, people who are vulnerable to going off the rails, have got less constraints. They've got less peer pressure around them. They've got less family connections that might keep them on track. And so those people have less constraints which prevent them from getting into crime. And the response of politicians is always to go straight to the instruments of the state, the police, the courts, the prison system, and to say, we must beef up these in order to control the wayward individuals down here. And they never really look at the kind of constraints that are needed on the ground to keep people out of crime and to keep people living in a safe community. So and I think that's just that's a trend all around the Western world. It's a trend in the wrong direction, but it's in response to some more fundamental changes that have been going on. So yeah, I always pull my hair out when I hear politicians talk about being tough on crime, because usually it means they're considering things that are not going to be effective. They think they are tough, but actually they will usually mean more people in prison, more reoffending by young people, and they won't actually reduce the amount of crime that takes place. So it's always extremely frustrating for me to listen to that, and the conservative response to get back to political ideas for a minute. I think that the genuinely conservative response to that is to look at how successful societies cohere and prevent crime taking place. So some of the societies that have the lowest crime rates in the world, like Japan, for instance, extremely low rates of crime. It's worth looking at why they have very low rates of crime, rather than jumping immediately to think that our best response is somehow to find more police and to give them greater powers.
Um, Another response to this incident or attack has been in New South Wales. The government came and said that the police now can define that there will be no protest in these 3 months. So just no protest march, you know. And then the other one is like for the Ashes test in Boxing Day test, there'll be very heavily armed police across the tests, the events are being cancelled, or there'll be very heavy police presence around the events. What does it says these measures
Yeah.
about the authority of the state, that I can't manage, or I can't give you the secure presence and the peaceful presence of there where you can go and have your protests, have your events, have your test matches, whatever. So I either have it under my very watchful, very, very heavily armed watch, or don't have it. That's the vision I
Yep.
take.
I think this is crazy. The idea of banning protest marches around the Palestine Israel issue, whatever side, I think that's just a retrograde step. And I noted too that in increasing security arrangements, they will tend to look at the big sporting events, such as a big crowd at the MCG. This is bizarre because if you look at all the incidents in Australia where there has been an incident involving a possible terrorist threat, it's never in the context of a big sporting event or a big concert. It's never. It's much more like what happened at Bondi. It's a localized place where one or two deranged individuals shoot some people. It's it's often in the most inconspicuous places. It's never at big sporting events where you need hundreds of security people. It's so misplaced, I think, to do that. The other one that I've mentioned is that the New South Wales I've come across is that the New South Wales government plans to increase or change legislation concerning hate speech. Yeah, again, yeah, there is such an indirect chain, I think, between legislation around hate speech and the Bondi tragedy. I don't know how changes to the regulation of hate speech are going to stop an event like Bondi from occurring. Again, it's such a knee-jerk response.
I've got two more questions on this. One is that there is a growing uh, calls for a royal commission to look at all these aspects in detail, but the government has been saying no, or the prime minister has been saying no every time. Where do you think? What do you think the government should do? Should it bring in a royal commission, or that's just a political standing from other parties or people?
This is such predictable politicking, isn't it? Um, it's become the standard now that whenever there's an issue that has a bit of complexity involved, the first response of politicians is to call for a royal commission. And really, in most cases, it's not required. In most cases, we know enough about the issues, we know enough about what the problem areas are, that governments ought to be able to get on and put in place a solution without having a royal commission. So in most cases, calls for a royal commission, I think, are a lazy form of politics, which tends to appeal to fairly lazy career politicians. In this case, I don't know what a royal commission into the events surrounding the Bondi shooting can achieve. Um, Is it that they might uncover some of the early, is there some early documentation around the two individuals which suggested that they were a possible threat and that was ignored? Well, I think we know that already. We know that was the case in relation to one of them. But what can we conclude from that? That the authorities should have acted in a more decisive action anyway, put him in jail anyway, in the hope that he might commit a shooting, and therefore, if we put such a person in jail, well, that closes off that possibility. I mean, it's hard to know what can be achieved by a royal commission in these in the specific issues concerning the shooting. The people who want a royal commission, though, also say, I think, that they want it to look into anti-Semitism. Now, this is a minefield. What can a royal commission possibly determine about that is going to be helpful? I think the people who want a royal commission probably want some significant changes to hate speech, so that probably any any support for Palestine is probably made more difficult to do. Any criticism of Israel is probably made more difficult. I think that's what they want. Whether that can be achieved in any sensible way is another thing, unless you introduce enormous restrictions on freedom of speech to talk about is the Israel-Palestine issue in any substantial way, because there will always be perspectives on that issue that other people won't like, and it's impossible to regulate that to the satisfaction of everybody. So it's hard to know what realistically a royal commission can achieve apart from putting political pressure on the Albanese government to say, you should have done more and we hold you responsible. And I think that's it, really. I don't think there's much else that... I don't think there's anything of substance that could be achieved by that.
Um, there's two other policy positions which have been proposed for after this attack. One is that don't bring foreign fights to Australia. Basically, it's a wish list. If you bring people from those areas to Australia, the fights will follow, because I can't just leave my sidings. Do you think we can really achieve that, not bringing foreign fights to Australia, or as long as we keep bringing people from those issue areas or volatile areas to Australia, these foreign fights will come, and it is inevitable that we will see pro-Palestine rallies and pro-Israel rallies, or same as for other fights across the world?
I don't think we can. No, I don't think it's possible. And the other area that I mean, this is the other issue that's raised is when people say that we just should restrict the number of people from Islamic countries to Australia. I'm not in favour of that. I don't. I think that's quite discriminatory on basis of faith. It's it's extremely one of the things that's happening is that a large number of highly skilled and educated people arrive in Australia, including a lot of highly educated Muslim people who arrive in Australia. It's almost impossible to vet the views of Muslim people coming in, to determine where they sit in any of the sort of contentious issues around this. I mean, you can devise a test, you can devise an interview. It's not going to stop people just producing the answers that they think the interviewer wants to hear. It's very easy to get around. I just don't think there's any sense in going down that road of wanting to discriminate against people of Islamic backgrounds. I don't think it's practical or sensible, and I think it's enormously discriminatory on the basis of faith, because people in the Islamic world are very diverse, as are people in any other religious group. So, and that's a very frustrating. I hear that opinion a lot. I understand why it's on the front of their minds, but that's my response to it. And and I know some people think that's a weak response. We should, it's quite a popular response. It's quite a popular thing to say, let's restrict Muslim immigration to Australia. But I don't support that.
Um, we discussed about the hate speech laws and more progress of the state governments and federal government. There has been a call for codifying our free speech laws, and I would say bring in US styled First Amendment rights on free speech, including the Brandenburg judgment, where you define what is a hate speech and then you work within that parameter. Do you think it is time for those things? Otherwise, the state governments will keep on taking more and more rights away from the people.
I think it's very, very difficult to legislate around hate speech, and very difficult to enforce. I think the unintended consequences are always bad. So I just think that the only workable arrangement on this is to say that that any threats of violence or actual violence must be treated very firmly, but speech which falls short of threats of violence I think at the end of the day has to be tolerated, even if it's unpleasant. I just think that the consequences of trying to regulate hate speech are too problematic, and the unintended consequences we know will be terrible.
Yeah. The more you police hate speech laws, the hate speech just goes underground. That's the only response.
Yeah.
And it doesn't goes away, it just goes underground. One thing that we haven't discussed, and I'd like to close with that, is the Jewish people are grieving across Australia. There's a lot of outpouring of support, and
Are they leaving?
the grieving. They're grieving because of this tragedy. And the people have been supportive. Every community, organization, government, everyone has been very supportive. Is there something that we can do something else to support, or that's the natural reaction and we will continue to support the Jewish people in their grievance for the time to come?
My approach to this is that I'm strongly committed to the idea of Australia being a multi-ethnic, multi-faith society. And in doing that, the challenge is always to not allow people from any one specific ethnicity or faith to form an enclave or a bubble in which they're cut off in substantial ways from other sections of society. And I think that has tended to happen in Australian cities. It's actually not in the country, actually, because immigrants who tend to sort of settle in the country interact more because you have to interact more with the whole community. You have to do that in smaller towns. In the cities, you can sometimes get away with not doing that. So the Jewish community, I think, has always occupied a kind of interesting position. They are quite segmented from the rest of society in quite significant ways. Schools, for instance. I mean, almost all Jewish people in Australia attend Jewish-only schools. Now, I think that's problematic. I think it's equally problematic for Muslims to attend Muslim-only schools, because it means that the mixing of people in a school isn't happening. I think that's problematic. Now, Jewish people will protest strongly and say, well, we must have our own schools because otherwise we will lose our identity. And Muslim people want their own schools for the same reason. But I think that's an important area where we haven't had near enough debate about. And it's not just in schools, but the Jewish community has a lot of institutions that are Jewish institutions. They're very good at running Jewish institutions. But at the same time, some Jews are very good. It's the same with every ethnic group. Some Jews are very good at interaction with the rest of society. Some are not so good, and some don't do it very much at all. So that mix is present in every ethnic group, and somehow we have to make it easier for people to mix across these lines of ethnicity and faith. And that's an important long-term objective for Australia, because I think we need to do much more in that area.
Whatever has community at that attack, what would look like justice to the Jewish community and the people who were? Is it the proper judicial process and the punishment to the perpetrators, or it has to be something else to them?
Well, I think in Australia, I think it's I think there should be a lot more effort put into the public arena to distinguish between the Jewish community and the issues around the state of Israel. Basically, just to make it clear that these are not the same thing. They're quite different things. And I think we should expect that from political leaders, but we should expect it from all our institutions, really, because one of the, I mean, especially at the moment, there's a strong campaign by the pro-Israel lobby to say that anti-Semitism is any any criticism of Israel, when in fact some Jewish people are amongst the strongest critics of the state of Israel, and always have been. And for them, it's very important that people do not, that the wider public does not confuse the two things, or to think that all Jews identify with the state of Israel, even though Prime Minister Netanyahu quite deliberately tries to conflate the two things. And he says, we, the state of Israel, act on behalf of all Jews. He says that, and it's not true. It's wildly false. So I think it's very important to say that. And and it's also just, I think, very important to try to increase the level of just understanding about, the history of Israel, even though it's a fairly complex history. But I've become very aware of how many people know very little about the history of Israel and Palestine, including people who have very strong views about it. And it's a major problem. There's major misunderstanding about this, and so much more needs to be done, really, to inform people about this. And what I try to say to people from my understanding of the history of Israel Palestine is that, and when people come back at me and they say, oh, the religious hatred in that part of the world has always been there, and it will always stop peace, and it will always stop them living together. And I say, no, this is not true, actually. Jews and Muslims and Christians and other religious groupings have lived in that part of the world together for thousands of years, peacefully, most of the time. It's been a very mixed demographics in that part of the world, culturally, religiously, ethnically. It's one of the most diverse parts of the world, actually. And for a long period, Jews and Muslims and Christians lived together in the same villages, working the same farms. That was normal for many hundreds of years. It's only from the late 19th century on that the Zionist movement began, which encouraged Jews, primarily from Europe, to move back to Palestine and settle there. And of course, by settling there, that was always going to be contentious. But that's a relatively recent thing. Historically, conflict has not been the norm. They've actually lived together peacefully most of the time. So I think that's, I try to say that to people, and I find most people are unaware of it. And it makes a big difference to how you think about the future of that part of the world and how you think about the future of the Jewish people. For most of the history of Judaism, and certainly for most of the history of Christianity, no one expected that there was going to be a homeland for Jews in that part of the world. It was actually a homeland for a wide range of different ethnic groups. So it's quite tragic that I think in the last 100 years that Israel has come to dominate that part of the Middle East, and also to dominate people's perception of what the Jewish community is. And I know that there are many Jewish community people who are very concerned about this and who try to change that perception. And their view is, and the message they try to say to people is the same message I try to say to them, which is that for most of the last few thousand years, Jewish people have lived in other communities with non-Jews, when the majority of people are Jews, the majority of people are non-Jews, but where the Jewish community has managed to live um, peacefully as part of a wider community, um, and we should remember that. We should say to Jews and Muslims, this this is the past, but it's also the future. You know, we have to find ways to go back to that, and so whether it's in Palestine or whether it's in Sydney, we have to find ways for Jews and Muslims and Christians and other religious groups and other ethnicities to know more about each other, to have more trust in each other, and to accept that living together is going to be how it's going to be forever. Um, and we should try to not make the state of Israel the focus for all the discussion about Jews and Arab and a whole range of other ethnicities who have lived in the Middle East. So I think that's the challenge, and I think it's it's an important one. But the Bondi events remind us how important it is to do that.
Yeah, yeah. With that hope, I think it's a good time to close. We can hope, we can all hope that we can all live together peacefully and solve these problems. We can work towards that full outcome. Thank, thank you for time. Uh,
Thank you. Terrific. Thank